I actually want to begin with the bridge because I don't know if you know this or not, but according to some on the internet, some conservative, I shouldn't say conservatives, right-leaning pundits on the internet, DEI is what collapsed the bridge. That's right. The diversity, equity, and inclusion of the Indian boat captain and his Indian crew on a Singapore flagged vessel on its way to Colombo, Sri Lanka. Yep, the DEI caused the problem. No, I'm not making that up. There are people who actually suggested that from the right. Also, that it was a cyber attack on the ship. We can't forget it was a cyber attack. That's what caused it. That's thinking, nope, it was an intentional terrorist attack. Let me give you the facts on the MV Dolly colliding with the Francis Scott Key Bridge. It's a Singapore-registered Neo-Panamax ship. That's a fancy way of saying that this is an enlarged ship that can go through the expanded locks in the Panama Canal. They made the lock system in the Panama Canal bigger so bigger ships could go through. This is one of those bigger container ships. It was traveling south from the Baltimore harbor loaded with cargo on its way to Colombo, Sri Lanka. It was departing in windy conditions. The ship, traveling at 8 knots or about 9 miles per hour, lost power. The cargo was piled up on top of the ship, as happens with those cargo ships, which operated as a sail in the heavy winds, began pushing the ship. As it was traveling south, it was pushing the ship towards the pylon. The ship, following proper procedure, dropped anchors. It appears that its starboard anchor dropped first, causing the ship to turn in that direction, and the other then dropped. It fired off Mayday alerts and drifted into the bridge's main truss-supporting pillar at around 1:30 in the morning, impacting at 7.8 miles per hour. Now, you can say, well, that's not fast. But the immovable object meeting the unstoppable force, when the unstoppable force is a massive multi-ton ship loaded with cargo, moving at roughly 8 miles an hour, is a massive, massive impact. Highway workers were working on the bridge at the time. They heard the Mayday alert from the ship and were genuine heroes, some of whom lost their lives. They threw themselves into action, physically blocking vehicles from getting onto the bridge, stopping traffic. They were repairing potholes. When the Mayday alert happened, they heard it. They jumped out of their vehicles, some of them. Others ran down the bridge, stopping traffic, and some of them died in the process of doing that. These men were heroes. In fact, of the people all missing, it is believed now they're all members of the highway department. That's the facts. The ship was set sail in December of 2014, and that's very important. It's very important you understand this. And again, I'm not an expert. I make no pretense at being an expert, but I know the experts. I know who to call. I know who to talk to. This ship did not have the Internet of Things on it in a way that could control it, stop it, or steer it. So even if there was a cyber attack on the ship into its computer systems, it could not have shut down the power on the ship. It was very analog. It couldn't have steered the ship. It couldn't have done any of those things. So the cyber attack is out because cyber attack was technically, physically impossible on this ship. It couldn't have been a terrorist attack because if it was a terrorist attack, they wouldn't have dropped anchors and signaled Mayday, Mayday. They would have just plowed straight into the bridge. They didn't do that. But within hours of people waking up on Tuesday morning, the catastrophizing began. And this is something very postmodern. And I need you to hear me on this. Some of you aren't going to like what I say, But many of you listening and many people in this country, many people online have moved to catastrophizing everything. That your first reaction is to presume the worst case scenario. It is a psychologically unhealthy twisting of the mind that we've gone through. And I really want to put my finger on 9/11 and say that's it. It got worse during COVID, certainly. And what many of you will yell back at me is, well, you can't trust the government anymore. COVID showed us you can't trust the government. But you've never before been dependent on the government telling you it was okay. You never used to start at the worst case scenario and work your way back. And yet people are starting at the worst case scenario. And then when the government says, well, that's not true, you say, well, I can't believe you. I have to believe the worst case scenario. That's actually a psychological problem with the people doing that. And it's many people. And I don't mean to offend you if you're one of them, but you've never had to depend on the government before. A healthy mind actually starts with the least bad scenario. And as evidence comes in, ratchets up. Here's the problem with ratcheting down. Ratchets never wind down. They always wind up. So when you ratchet all the way up to the worst case scenario, it is extremely difficult to unwind back down. Now, it's not just the ship. There's a great example here, so you understand what I'm talking about. Donald Trump said there would be a bloodbath in America if we allowed in these Chinese imports from Mexico. It would destroy the economy. It would destroy the American auto industry. The left, when it was pointed out to them that he wasn't meaning violence in America, he was meaning metaphorical bloodbath to the economy and auto workers, refused to ratchet down from the worst case scenario. Despite the evidence, despite the statements, they grabbed hold of worst case scenario. This is going to be violence in America, and they couldn't unwind themselves, because when you start at the worst case scenario, it's really hard to back down from the worst case scenario. And so you justified, and they justified it as, well, he has a history of violent rhetoric. This is just par for the course. In the same way, many people on the right say, well, you can't trust the government. The government's always wrong. It's got to be terrorism. That's really unhealthy thinking. I was talking to a friend who said that in abuse situations and things, psychologically, that people who are sustained victims of abuse oftentimes catastrophize everything. And you have to essentially work with them to reprogram their minds to calm down and get back to, when something bad happens, don't go immediately to the worst case scenario. You know, actually, ironically, in the worst case scenarios, there's usually more evidence. And so when you try to ratchet down from and de-escalate from worst case scenario to least case scenario, there's actually less evidence. There's always less evidence for a tragic, unfortunate accident than there is for malicious nefariousness, because, I mean, take terrorism. They brag about it. The Russian concert hall, ISIS took credit for it. Had a massive cyber attack in the nation a couple years ago. The North Koreans took credit for it. They brag about it in various ways. When the Russians hack your computer systems, they send you a demand letter. They brag about it. You know it. When it's the accident, when the machine malfunctions, no one's taking credit for it because it's an accident. It's a malfunction. There's less evidence. But people now are prone to catastrophize and then blame the government and say, well, it's their fault because we can't trust our institutions. But you never needed the government to tell you what to think before. You never needed the government to tell you the world was okay. You presumed the world was okay. Part of this is postmodernism. In postmodernism, people are skeptical of truth claims, and people are skeptical and hostile to objectivity. In postmodernism, we all do this. I find myself doing this sometimes, saying I feel instead of I think. People say this now so much more. I feel like, or I feel that, as opposed to I think. I don't care what you feel. Tell me what you think. But in postmodernism, it's emotional. It's not rational. And all of us are prone to this because we are catechized by those we are around. And in culture, postmodernism has become this dominant force in society where you have your truth, I have my truth. There's no such thing as objective truth. It's too complicated. Exceptions become the rules become the exceptions. This is the world we're in. And so we all can fall into this. But I want you to understand, and I have got to make this point to you, and this is so important for you to understand. When you catastrophize events, When you decide that this thing that happened is the worst thing ever, or this thing that happened, it must be malicious, it can't be an accident. When you do that, and that's your starting point, it's extremely unhealthy thinking and very often not true. The reason it's unhealthy thinking is because so often it's not true. But the other thing is, when you catastrophize events, when you decide to go with the worst case scenario first, it becomes way, way easier for people to manipulate you. It's actually far easier to manipulate you when you start with it was a terrorist attack than it is to manipulate you when you start with it was an accident, because you're going to want the credible evidence to ratchet up from it was an accident. With terrorism, oh my gosh, it was terrorism. Anything they say can fool you. It makes the government more powerful when people unload their critical thinking to the government and say, well, I can't believe the government. The government doesn't say. What you're actually doing is you're allowing the government to control your thoughts by your disbelief in the government. Instead of exercising your own rational thinking when you catastrophize, it gives the government more prominence in your life and the government more prominence in your thought process. It makes people vulnerable to predatory behaviors of others seeking to influence them. It risks discrediting real catastrophes because of the boy who cried wolf scenario. And then while it maximizes conspiracies, it actually minimizes real disaster. It takes accident out of the equation, and people need to understand that bad things happen. And oftentimes, their coincidences are coincidences. They're not correlated and they're not causated. They're just coincidences. In Minnesota, the I-35 bridge collapsed, killing 13 people, injured 145 people. It was because of engineering designs, and they had laid more and more plates and more asphalt and concrete on top of a bridge that couldn't sustain the weight, and it ultimately collapsed. It wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't terrorism. And it was back in 2007 or so when people weren't as used to catastrophizing. They didn't jump. Everybody didn't jump to terrorism, prove me wrong. They started with, it might have been terrorism, but I'm assuming it was something else. Then, of course, there was the Sunshine Skyway Bridge in Tampa, Florida. 35 people died. It got hit by a boat and collapsed in 1980. It was an accident. When you catastrophize, in addition to making yourself more vulnerable to the predatory behavior of others that we're seeing online, in addition to actually amplifying the influence of government by catastrophizing, you're also forgetting, minimizing, and downplaying acts of nature have always happened and will always happen. Social media is poisoning people's minds and enabling the liars, the clickbaiters, and the predators to prey on us. Postmodernism is a dangerous thing for our minds. Y'all, there's absolute truth in the world. How do I know there's absolute truth in the world? Because Jesus Christ said he is the way, the truth, and the life. And if he is, then there must be real, absolute, identifiable truth. And I believe there is. I want to ask you to do something, please. Stop going to the worst case scenario first, and stop listening to the people who jump to the worst case scenario first, because you're giving them disproportionate influence. You're actually giving the government more influence. And you're degrading the rational portion of your mind and giving it over to the emotional controls of your mind. And that is a dangerous, dangerous thing for us to do in a highly online society where predators are always trying to prey on the emotionally vulnerable among us.
When the world seems crazy,